October 1941. The Eastern Front. The left boot had a crack along the sole, not a break. A crack. 2 fingers wide, running from the ball of the foot toward the heel. He had known about it for 3 days. He said nothing. Saying something meant stopping, and stopping on a road like that one meant sinking. The road that appeared on the maps no longer existed. In summer, it had been a secondary route northeast, through birch forests and open fields. By October, it was something else entirely, something without a name in German. The Russians had a word for it, Rasputitsa, the season of no roads, the season of mud. Theodor Brandt had found a pamphlet somewhere that explained it. He read it aloud one evening while they crouched under a tarpaulin, strung between 2 birch trees. He said the word twice, slowly, Rasputitsa. Then he folded the pamphlet, put it in his pocket, and said nothing else. The mud spoke for itself. It came up past the ankles with every step, a wet, reluctant sound, like the ground was holding on. The man commanding this story has 43 soldiers when they cross the Ugra. Less than he's supposed to have, but more than some. 4 dead in a Soviet artillery strike near Vyazma, 2 more to illness in the weeks after. One of them died of a fever that in normal conditions shouldn't have killed anyone. In normal conditions, there would have been a field hospital within reasonable distance. In the mud, reasonable distance means nothing. Karl Reiss marched just behind him most days. From Hamburg, he had fought in France, but France hadn't prepared him for this. Nothing prepared anyone for this. Willy Frisch carried a photograph of his daughter in his breast pocket, 3 years old, sitting on a step in Würzburg, squinting into the sun. After France, he stopped showing it, but his hand went to his chest sometimes without him noticing. Checking. The uniforms were summer issue. The same field grey they'd worn since June, designed for temperate conditions. Brandt had a Soviet padded jacket he'd found in a village, dark and shapeless, worn under his tunic so the Feldwebel wouldn't comment. Reiss had wrapped his head in a length of civilian cloth that in a previous life had probably been a curtain. The army had promised winter equipment. It was sitting in depots somewhere in Poland, held back because fuel and ammunition took priority on the rail lines, and because someone at a level far above them had calculated that Moscow would fall before the cold made winter gear necessary. Moscow had not fallen. The cold had not consulted the calculation. On October 14th, Feldwebel Meinhard came along the column and said Mojaisk had fallen. He said it without particular emphasis, the way he said everything, as information to be registered, not celebrated. Mojaisk was on the road to Moscow. Moscow was perhaps 200 kilometers east of where they stood, in the mud, in the rain, in boots with cracked soles, 2 fingers wide, letting in water. The freeze came overnight, not gradually, overnight. On the evening of November 14th, the mud was still mud. On the morning of the 15th, it was stone. He stepped outside the farmhouse where they'd slept, 4 walls and half a roof, which was more than most nights, and put his foot down and felt nothing give. The ground held. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, just standing, feeling the solidity of it under the boot. Then he walked over to Brandt and told him. Brandt already knew. He'd been up for an hour. The dry cold was different from the damp, grey cold of October. It had edges. When he breathed, the air caught at the back of the throat in a way he'd never experienced before. In Regensburg, the winters were cold. Cold the way Bavarian winters are cold, which is to say unpleasant but manageable, with the right clothing and a heated room nearby. There were no heated rooms nearby. The weapons began to fail. The oil in the mechanisms thickened in the cold. Some men stopped lubricating their rifles entirely, which created different problems. The light machine gun in Brandt's section jammed twice in the same day during a brief engagement. He cleared it both times. The second time his hands were shaking enough that it took longer than it should have. Private Brower arrived with the replacements on November 21st, 19 years old, somewhere near Dresden. He had the look of someone who had been told one version of events and was now encountering another. Rice looked at him for a long moment and then asked if he had felt-lined boots. Brower said he had the standard issue. Rice said nothing further and showed him where to put his kit. On November 28th, Brandt said someone in the 2nd platoon had looked through binoculars from a rise to the east and thought he'd seen something. Dark shapes on the horizon, against the sky. Could be anything. Probably nothing. Decker took 4 men up to the rise. He was one of them, for no particular reason other than he was nearby when Decker looked around for someone. He put the binoculars to his eyes and looked east. The terrain was flat and white, broken by dark lines of forest. The sky pale, almost colorless, the low winter sun somewhere behind cloud. He moved the binoculars slowly across the horizon. There was something, far out, on the very edge of what the glass could resolve. Dark shapes, vertical, slightly irregular against the sky. Could have been anything, a factory chimney, a water tower, a church steeple. He looked for a long time. He handed the binoculars back to Decker without speaking. That evening, Willy Frisch said he had seen the Kremlin. He said it with complete seriousness, no joke, that he had been up to the rise the day before, borrowed someone's binoculars, and had seen the towers. He described them specifically, the height, the color, the shape against the sky. Whether he had actually seen them or had constructed them from what he knew they looked like was impossible to say. Nobody contradicted him. On December 1st, the attack orders came. The division would push east from Naro-Fominsk along the main road. The objective was to break through the Soviet line and advance toward Moscow. They moved out before dawn. The cold was around -20. The Soviet artillery started before they had covered 200 meters. Willy Frisch was hit 3 hours into the attack. Small arms fire from a tree line they were trying to clear. He went down on his right side and stayed down. They reached him with Rice covering from behind a fallen tree. The wound was in the upper left arm. Painful, serious, but not immediately fatal if treated. He got a field dressing on it and told him to stay behind the tree and not move. Frisch said something about his hand, his right hand, the one with the white fingers, that didn't make sense in context. Shock, probably. He left him there and moved forward. By early afternoon, it was clear the attack had failed. He counted the men when they returned to Naro-Fominsk, 36. He had left with 43. Some parts of this account were too detailed to include here. On December 4th, he drew the guard rotation that put him outside from 2 in the morning until 4, the coldest part of the night. Brandt's thermometer had read -28 before lights out. By 2 in the morning, it would be lower than that. The river was completely frozen. 3 days earlier, the center channel had still been moving. Tonight, it was still, the whole surface white in the darkness. The eastern bank was dark, no movement, no light. He stood at the wall for 2 hours. The cold came through the boots, through the layers he was wearing, into the feet and up through the legs, in a slow, deliberate progression he'd learned to manage by moving, shifting weight, flexing his toes, small, deliberate movements to keep the blood going without spending energy he didn't have. Somewhere in the second hour, he stopped moving and just stood and listened. Nothing. The absolute stillness of very cold air. No wind, no distant guns in either direction. The front stretched hundreds of kilometers in both directions, and all of it in that moment was silent, In that silence, though he couldn't have said so then, something had already ended. They came on the 5th. They heard them before they saw them. Not the artillery first, and that came later, but movement. Sound travels farther and with more clarity when the air is very cold and very still. The Siberians were different. He'd heard about them in the weeks before. Fresh divisions from the Soviet Far East, transferred from the Manchurian border after some diplomatic arrangement with Japan. Men accustomed to cold, men with equipment designed for cold. When they came across the Nara that morning in the thin early light, he understood the distinction immediately. They wore white, not the field grey and brown of the Soviet units they'd been fighting since October. White camouflage over their uniforms, white covers on their helmets, moving across the snow in a way that made them difficult to fix with the eye. Against the German field grey, they were the visible ones. The fighting at the river lasted most of the morning. He won't reconstruct it in detail. Detail implies a clarity that wasn't there. What he has is a sequence of images and sounds and physical sensations that fit together imperfectly. By midday, they were being pushed back from the riverbank. Not routed, pushed back, withdrawing under pressure while maintaining unit cohesion. It was a meaningful distinction, one he held to, because the alternative was something he didn't permit himself to name. The retreat continued for days. Every day was cold and movement, and the ongoing calculation of men and equipment, and how far the next position was, and whether they could reach it before dark. They lost 2 men to cold alone, not to enemy action, to cold, in the 2nd week of December. One fell behind during a night movement and was never found. The other sat down during a halt and didn't stand back up. Brauer disappeared on the night of the 7th. Not in battle, in the confusion of a night withdrawal from one building to another. He had 32 men going into that movement. He had 31 coming out. Race went back twice along the route, in the dark, in -30 degrees, and found nothing. By dawn, it was too late to search further. He wrote Brauer's name in the margin of a map he was carrying because he had nothing else to write it in. He didn't know why. The map wasn't a record of anything. It was a reflex. What happened next is described in much more detail in the original testimony. By December 20th, the line began to stabilize. The orders said to establish defensive positions and hold. The language was different from the orders of early December. These orders didn't mention Moscow. They didn't mention objectives beyond the immediate ground. Hold. On December 23rd, Brandt told him the thermometer had reached its lower limit. -30 was as far as it went. He held it up and showed him the mercury sitting at the very bottom of the scale, hard against the end. Below that, the thermometer had no language. He looked at it for a moment, then put it in his pocket. January 1st came and went without distinction from the days before or after. On the morning of January 2nd, he counted the men. 29. He had left Regensburg with a company. He had left France with experience. He had left the summer with certainty that the campaign would resolve before the cold made certainty irrelevant. 29 men from the 43 of October. And October had already been a reduced number from what the roster said they should have been. 29 men who were present and functional. Functional meant different things now than it had in October. Rice was functional with 2 dead toes. Frisch was functional with 7 fingers and 1 arm working at reduced capacity. Brandt was functional with a persistent cough that had started in the 3rd week of December, a dry sound in the cold air that neither of them commented on. He wrote the number in the margin of the map where he had written Brauer's name. On the morning of January 10th, he went outside before the others were awake. It was still dark, or the particular not dark of a Russian winter night, the ambient light of snow under cloud that was neither day nor night, but something that existed between them. He stood in the farmyard and looked east. The terrain was flat and white, and went on until the dark line of a forest, perhaps 800 meters out. And beyond the forest was more flat white terrain that he knew extended for a very long distance in the direction he was looking. Somewhere in that direction, at a distance he could no longer calculate with any precision, was the city they had been told would fall before the first snow. It had snowed perhaps 15 times since then. The city was still there. They were still here. These two facts existed in a relationship he didn't have the language for. Standing in a farmyard in -22 degrees in January of 1942, with 29 men behind him and a front that stretched beyond all comprehension in both directions. He stood and looked east until the light came. Then he went inside, woke Brandt for the morning rotation, and lay down on the floor where Brandt had been lying. The cold floor came through his coat, the same way it had every morning since October. He closed his eyes. Behind him, the door closed. Outside, the front was quiet. 29 men, the same number as the morning before. If you stayed until the end, then you already know this is only part of the story. The full testimony, with all the details without limitations, is available on my Patreon. Link in the description.